So coming from making web apps in React to making mobile apps with React Native, these are just kind of my first impressions of React Native. Now, one thing that I didn't know, which was good to learn, is that React itself is actually platform agnostic. So you use React with React DOM to create web apps, and you use React with React Native to make mobile apps. So it's both React, it's all React, but there's just a different library for each. Now, React Native, immediately it struck me as very similar to using React Bootstrap. I was getting really familiar with using React Bootstrap, which is just basically a styling library for React apps, and it's a pre-styled components basically. So in React Bootstrap, you might use a container instead of a div to contain your component, and then in React Native is called a view. Instead of using a div, you use a view to contain a component, and that's just one example. But there's lots of different components that you use with React Native, which is very handy. You just need to kind of go through the docs and get to know them, right? So similar to that, another thing that you use in React Native is React Navigation, which is like the native version of React Router. It helps navigate between screens. They're called screens in mobile development. Instead of navigating between parents, not parents, I'm a little distracted because I'm a parent. Navigating between pages, that's what I meant to say, in React, in web apps. So anyway, and I must say that the documentation, the docs in React Navigation are much better, much more beginner friendly with lots of examples. They're updated with hooks and it's amazing, versus I just had a lot of trouble with the docs for React Router personally. They might be fine and they're just not very geared towards beginners possibly. That's always a possibility. Now, one other big difference between React Native and React DOM, or making web apps versus mobile apps, is the styling. You don't have a CSS file that you import. You're not doing CSS at all. Now, you're doing something that you actually can do in web apps as well, which is inline styling is one option, but you can also use a style sheet object to create the styles that you want. And once again, it's becoming familiar with those properties. So yeah, they're not going to be the exact same as CSS properties, but they're going to be very similar, And I actually really enjoy styling in that way, because you're just using JavaScript, just a JavaScript object instead of using something completely different. Okay, so those are the first few things that I learned in React Native. And then as I've been building more, there are lots of other things to consider with mobile app development. For example, more complex, like screen orientation, like is it portrait or landscape, and how do you make it one or the other? Accessing the camera, or and there's lots of different built-in functionality, like I just learned today about Async. What's it called? It's basically a replacement for local storage. You can store. There's actually a component that helps you to store token or user data in your phone storage, so that you can stay logged in. You can have automatic login until the token expires, and different things like that. So it's definitely learning a new platform. But if you're a React developer and you're familiar with working with React, it's not that hard to go from one to the other, which is probably one reason why it's gaining so much popularity. And also the fact that you can use it for both Android and iOS. That's also a perk. Speaking of which, one of the hardest things for me so far has been using the emulators, or the so there's Xcode, which is for the iOS simulator, and then there's Android Studio, which is for the Android simulator. And at first it's super cool because you have these phones, fake phones on your screen, and so you can see what it looks like on both iOS and Android, which is very convenient. But what's not convenient is all the configuration challenges that I was running into. You know, how to reload it, how to wipe the memory so that it's not taking up the same port or whatever it is. And it ends up as a big pain. I'm sure as I get more experienced in troubleshooting with those, it will be less of a pain. But I basically have just been using my own phone, which is also a great experience because it's a real phone. And you basically just send yourself, I'm using Expo, which is, anyway, I won't go into too much detail, but you can get the app on your phone before you ever build it and deploy it, basically, and so that you can test it out just like it's a real app. So that's what I've been doing. There's also React Native Dev Tools, which I also had difficulty getting up and running. So I've been using mostly console logs to see what my current state is and different things like that. But you know what? Console logs can get you a long way. I love the Redux Dev Tools and different things for the convenience, but yeah, you can get by with console logs pretty far. So anyway, those are my first impressions of React Native. As someone who's still getting into it and learning a lot about the ins and outs of it. But it's just a lot of fun to learn something new, even with all the struggles involved. That's one of the joys of web development.